Remember to go stand in the box.
Okay, good evening. Hello, hello. I'm Sandro Duranti. I'm the Dean of Social Sciences here at UCLA, and I want to welcome you all tonight for this very special occasion. And first, I want to welcome the people who usually do not come to UCLA, maybe because you can't find a parking place or whatever it is. So congratulations for coming, and it's a pleasure to see you here. And this is really an event dedicated, aimed at people who are not usually here, who do not work usually here at UCLA. But we also have a lot of people who are from UCLA, and we have all kinds of deans, and we have professors, and we have graduate students, and we have some of their families and other people. So I want to welcome everybody, and also the people who are watching this somewhere there on the internet, and the people in the future, because we're very future-oriented. And actually, we are in the future right now, if you want to really know. So what is this about? Well, here's the story. So 2.5 years ago, we started something called Startup UCLA. And it was an immediate success. And the first summer, we had an accelerator program. And at the end of that program, we had a demo day here, precisely in this room. And I came to those events. Actually, there were two demo days. And I was listening to the undergraduates. And they were telling about these very amazing, interesting apps that they've been working on in teams. They were pitching their story, their product. And I was sitting there and I thought, wow, they are so good. I mean, they were so clear, to the point. There was an interesting story, perfect pitch. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if we did this with the graduate students? So that was the beginning of this idea. And then I met someone who likes to hear new ideas, because I needed somebody who would be funding this. So I met Dan Greenberg, who's sitting right here in the front, together with his wife, Susan Steinhauser. And the two of them are really wonderful friends of universities and new ideas. And so here, the time came for us to try out this idea. And so the next thing I did was, okay, find someone who can help me to make it possible. And so I went to my associate dean and colleague and friend, Jim Stigler. I'm going to introduce him in a moment to you. And so the idea here really is to try to find a way for the graduate students who are doing these very interesting projects, very complex issues, societal issues of all kinds that you'll see in the social sciences, and to see whether they can tell their story. They can tell the story about what's exciting about this project, this passion that they have, about trying to understand the problems in the world and societies, and also think about solutions. And so this is what they're going to do tonight. They're going to tell a story. They're going to tell their story. And it is very different from the way they usually talk when they are with the people in their own department. And so we're able to do all of this, and we're very, very excited about tonight. And I want to say that this overall, as I'm thinking back about all this, I think, you know what? This was both crazy and brave. So I am the crazy one. They are the brave ones. So with that in mind, I want to introduce to you this amazing professor here at UCLA in the Department of Psychology, and one of my amazing associate deans, very creative people, and they like to play with ideas and new things, and Jim Sigler.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I want to just say a little bit about the program that they've gone through for the past 10 weeks. For the past 10 weeks, Dean Durante, who we call Sandro, and I have met every Thursday evening with this amazing group of graduate students. And we started in the beginning really working backwards from today. So the first thing we assigned them to do was to write an 1,100-word script for an 8-minute presentation, which they all did because they're amazing. And those scripts that they produced bear almost zero resemblance to what you're going to hear tonight. So what did we do for the rest of those 10 weeks? Well, we had dinner once a week, and we talked about our projects, and we tried to find the story in each project. And then they traded the stories and tested them out on each other. And what they were doing is learning how to talk about their research across lots of disciplines, because we have political scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists. I may have forgotten one. History. I knew I forgot history. Okay, and that's what we did. We also gave them some exercises that Sandra and I, because we're both crazy, made up. So for example, one week, we told the students they should come up with a list of 5 names of people, that not people they know, but people who they would like to be aware of their work because they think it could make an impact on the world. And then the next week, without telling them, we told them they had to phone up those people and try to get interviews with at least 2 of them. And one of the people put Barack Obama on their list. So they did everything we told them to do, because they didn't know us that well yet. And they came back and reported on these interviews, and most of the people they called said, what? Why are you calling me? And then they said things that we're all used to hearing from our relatives when we try to explain our research. Some of them said, well, everybody knows that. Why are you spending all this time proving it? Or they said, everybody knows that's not true. How come you're telling me that's true? But they're learning how to test their stories with people that they want to influence. The other thing that we did throughout the quarter is we brought in an amazing presentation coach. Oh, I forgot I'm supposed to be pushing buttons because this is us at our weekly meetings. And then we brought in a presentation coach, Barbara Seymour Giordano, who's here today, right there. Amazing. And as the quarter went on, the students increasingly, intensely worked with Barbara to craft their presentations. So our goal in all this was to help the students learn to present their ideas to the non-academic audience. So we're not trying to replace their dissertation advisor. Dissertation advisors are very good at teaching the students how to talk to their own special subfield of whatever field they're in. But what we did is try to teach them to be bilingual so that they could also talk to the general public and across disciplines. And that's what we tried to do in this program. And you're going to see the fruits of that tonight. Now, at the end of the program, we also had this crazy idea. Everyone in your program is a ballot, and we want everyone to vote for their top 3 favorite presentations using whatever criteria you want. And we're going to have winners, and the top 3 winners are going to get cash prizes. But saying that, which seemed like a good idea 10 weeks ago, now we know these people, these amazing young students, and to Sandro and I think I can speak for both of us in saying they are all winners. We're so proud of these students, and for us it was just a great privilege to be able to get to know each of these marvelous young graduate students working on their dissertations. So that's all we're going to say, and we're going to turn it over to the students. I'm going to introduce each one, and each one will talk for approximately 8 minutes. Our first speaker tonight is Kezia Conrad from the Department of Anthropology, who's going to talk about the extraordinary power of ordinary life in post-war Bosnia.
What is peace? Where does it begin? And who actually makes it? As an anthropologist, researching the traumatic effects of war, my goal has been to understand how people recover, both in their personal and family lives and in society as a whole. My first trip to Bosnia was in 2002. I had signed up to be part of a group that worked for peace in the war-torn region. I arrived eager to get to work and help with peace-building efforts. And I had read maybe 5 or 6 books about the war, so I felt I had a good idea of what I was about to encounter. Through those books, I had learned that over half the population had been driven from their homes, and thousands upon thousands of people had been killed. I knew that Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks were involved, and I had read that Serbs in particular had committed atrocities against Bosniaks, the Bosnian Muslims. Initially, I worked with a local organization that promoted interfaith dialogue through a community choir. I was excited to join the group. They were comprised of Catholic Croats, Orthodox Christian Serbs, and Muslim Bosniaks, who all came together to sing one another's music for peace. But the singers were not at all what I had expected. Most of them seemed less concerned about peace and more interested in hanging out together or taking a free trip to Germany when the choir went on tour. And they didn't seem religious at all. Many of them were atheists, or they came from mixed families. One of them told me, "In this choir, I'm a soprano and that's all." They would tell me that the choir's work was very important, but then in the next breath they'd go on to say, "But it's really nothing new. In Bosnia, we've been living this way for centuries and we don't need any help doing it." Did audiences know what these singers really thought? Every concert we gave, we'd sing our hearts out for peace, but in reality, backstage, to me it looked like nobody cared. I felt betrayed. But as I began to relax, let go of my own ideas of what constituted peacemaking, and just learn from the group, that's when I began to understand that by refusing to change the way they thought about themselves and others, by refusing to label and categorize people, my fellow singers were making a powerful and profound statement. What I learned from the choir is that the war in Bosnia made a huge change in the meaning of ethnic belonging. What used to be difference became an enormous division. Croats, Bosniaks, and Serbs often lived in the same towns and the same apartment buildings, and they were friends. But when the war started, the terrible violence could take those same people and turn them into enemies who feared and hated one another and couldn't imagine being neighbors. Ironically, many of the efforts to make peace only highlighted these differences and set them in stone. The peace accord, which finally stopped the fighting in 1995, also organized public life along the lines of ethnic difference. The peace accord created such a complicated and bizarre system of government that there are actually 3 presidents at the same time, one Croat, one Serb, and one Bosniak, each of them claiming to represent and protect the interests of their own people against everybody else. You can imagine how well that works. And many employers also hire according to an ethnic quota system. So the upshot of this is that it really matters what group you belong to. Ethnicity is no longer your private choice of what religious holiday you celebrate at home with your family, but it's something that really makes a difference in your life chances. So this is what the choir singers were responding to when they refused to categorize themselves publicly. Now, because of my experiences with the choir, I became interested in so-called mixed families, families where the relationships cross ethnic lines. These families had to cope with the new divisiveness of ethnicity. They had to absorb it into their most intimate relationships. From my research with mixed ethnicity families, I'd like to share one story, a story about a woman I'm calling Vera and her mother. Vera is about 60 years old. She's Catholic, a Croat. And she told me that when she got married, her mother was upset that she had chosen a Bosniak, a Muslim man. Still, she didn't worry too much about that. up until the war. And that's when her brother came to her and said ugly things about Muslims, and her mother shocked her by saying, well, yeah, didn't you ever realize it before? Your brother and I are on one side, and you are on the other. Vera says that is one of the most traumatic moments of her life. Even though she also lived through the siege of Sarajevo, her neighborhood was shelled constantly for 4 years, and her husband was wounded in the fighting. But what's remarkable to me about this story is that Vera did not write off her mother. In the 19 years since the war, she and her husband have actually gone out of their way to restore and keep up this relationship with Vera's mother. In fact, right now, they're the primary people who care for her as she's aging and she's not able to do things like get to the grocery store or clean her apartment alone. Vera's mother still is mean and spiteful and makes racist comments at times, but Vera hangs on to that relationship. We don't talk about everything, she told me, and we pretend everything is okay. Is Vera's relationship with her mother a shining example of reconciliation? Maybe not, but it is a powerful response. Day after day, Vera refuses to see her mother as an enemy. Instead, she honors the bond between mother and daughter in small, everyday ways. Right now, I'm, of course, in Los Angeles finishing my dissertation, but I'm still learning from Bosnia. These days, I've been glued to the internet, following the news about protests, a movement people are calling the Bosnian Spring. For the first time in 20 years, Bosnia's people are standing up to nationalist politicians who have gained power during the war. They've been going out into the streets to protest, and they've been coming together in large citizens' assemblies to discuss their goals. The protesters are calling for radical changes. They want jobs, food for their families. When they're sick, they want to be able to go to the doctor without paying bribes. They want the government to actually carry out basic tasks like providing birth certificates to newborn babies. When you really look at them, their demands are ordinary, mundane. The chance to live a normal life is what they're looking for. When I first went to Bosnia, I was looking for the big, dramatic gestures of peace and reconciliation. But the experience of living and researching in Bosnia for the past 12 years, over the past 12 years, that has changed the way I see things. What I see now is the extraordinary power of the most ordinary, mundane, everyday actions, and how they can ultimately change the world.
Fantastic. Our next speaker, also from the Department of Anthropology, is Anna Corwin. Nuns, Prayer, and the Language of Aging Well.
Imagine the last years of your life. Who will you be surrounded by? When your body begins to age, when your legs become unsteady and you can no longer bathe yourself, who will be there? How will they care for you? By the year 2030, in just 16 years, the number of older Americans is set to nearly double, skyrocketing from 40 to 73 million people. And as we live longer, the number of us suffering from chronic conditions, things like as well as things like depression and loneliness at the end of life, will increase. And it's estimated that 70% of adults will eventually be unable to care for themselves unassisted. As a 6-year-old, I remember holding my mom's hand as we walked down the hall of the nursing home where my great-grandmother lived. I could hear echoed moans and pleas for help behind the closed doors that we passed. And as I stood, staring at her, nearly holding my breath, I could see fear in my great-grandmother's eyes. Requiring more care than we could give, she had been plucked from the family home and deposited in this medical prison. And although we visited her, we had no idea what to say, and she had no words left to communicate with us. The majority of us, more than 2/3, will die this way, in a medical institution, away from the familiarity of home and our loved ones. I didn't want this to happen to my great-grandmother or to anyone I loved. So, 7 years ago, I began my doctoral studies in linguistic anthropology. My initial goal was to try to understand how young Catholic women learned to be nuns. There was just one small problem. When I arrived at the convent, I had just unpacked my bags in the convent bedroom where I would be living. I discovered that there were only 2 nuns, 2 young nuns. The majority of the 250 nuns in this convent were in their 70s, 80s, 90s, 100s. Half of them lived in the infirmary wing and the assisted living wing of the convent, and they no longer wore habits. When I first went into that infirmary in the convent, it appeared to be quite similar to my great-grandmother's nursing home. I could hear faraway moans. I could see medical furniture. There were nurses in scrubs. But then it quickly became clear that this place was really quite different. Sister Betsy was one of the first people I met in the convent infirmary. Sitting in her chair, unable to walk due to spinal deterioration, she, unlike my great-grandmother, had no fear in her eyes. She was chronically ill, but her way of being in her body was warm, confident, unashamed. Whenever someone walked into the room, her eyes would light up, and she would take their hand in hers. Walking out of Sister Betsy's room, I remember seeing a 100-year-old nun wandering down the hall in her wheelchair. She was babbling non-syllables. I was sure that nobody could understand what she was saying. But every nun and every nurse who passed her would reach out and touch her and address her as a competent, valued member of the community. In the United States, elderly people are usually spoken to with a type of condescending speech that researchers call elder speak. It involves simplified sentences and demeaning endearments, things like, "Hi, honey, are we ready to put on our sweater?" It's nearly ubiquitous in nursing homes and assisted living homes, and it causes cognitive decline. But it never happened in the convent infirmary. When fellow nuns would visit the elderly nuns who were shaking from Parkinson's or who could no longer speak, they would share with them the day's news. They would reminisce with them. They would play cards with them. They treated them as competent peers right up to the very end. I found in the convent that aging didn't have to be simply endured. It could be lived gracefully, with love, peace, acceptance. Epidemiologists have found that Catholic nuns, like the ones in my study, experience greater health and longevity than the rest of us. Some of the reasons for this are straightforward. For example, they have consistent nutrition throughout their adult lives. They continue to work and engage their brains for a lot longer than their contemporaries. And they have higher education than their peers. Some of the reasons for this are also their religious lives. For example, the nuns believe that when they die, they have something to look forward to, that they'll go to heaven, that they'll be reunited with their peers. But a lot of their religious practices are also social practices. And a lot of what the nuns do is really about caring for each other and not necessarily about communicating with a higher being. For example, when the nuns pray, I found that they ask God for help in the world. But when I began to decode these prayers, I found that on top of this basic structure of the prayer, the nuns had embedded additional information that was actually directed to the other nuns in the room. And so, for example, if they were praying for a nun who had fallen and broken her hip, they would include information in the prayer about what room and what floor this nun was on. So it became clear that these prayers, that the nuns had developed this code that built into their everyday lives a way of communicating to each other the needs of the people in the convent without having to ask each other directly for help. Something that actually, asking directly for help is something that actually creates stress, both in the person doing the asking and in the person providing the care. The prayers did other things as well. For example, although the nuns, of course, want to be healthy and they work towards wellness, they almost never ask God for the impossible. So I never heard prayers for someone to be completely cured from cancer. Instead, I heard the nuns pray for someone who was ill to experience serenity or peace in her illness. And the nuns also used prayer as a way to teach each other how to age. So they served as gentle reminders to the nuns that although illness and death were unavoidable, they were not alone, and these things could be endured, and endured more easily if one focused not on the pain itself, but on a sense of peace and love and acceptance. Neurologists have shown that the brain is flexible and that the tasks or things we repeat over and over and over again become routinized pathways in the brain. The same is true for language and emotion. So we speak what we experience, and we experience what we speak. The emotions that we call up again and again, like the nuns do when they pray, using words to cultivate a sense of peace, love, support. If we do this over and over, the brain becomes trained to recognize these emotions more quickly and easily. And while many of us know that if we exercise and we eat well, we'll age better, we'll be healthier, what the nuns teach us is that the way we speak to each other can also play a profound role in how we age. My work has focused on elderly nuns, but in reality, these women have practiced this way of communicating since they joined the convent as 18-year-old girls. Could it be that what the nuns possess and practice daily, being fully present in the moment and accepting what is, could this approach to life be a roadmap for us all? My dream is that we take the essence of what we've learned from the nuns and begin to apply it to our own lives. Why wait until you're 70, 80, 90? Whatever your age, consider the language you use every day. The practices you engage in each day could hold the mirror to your future.
And now, from the Department of Psychology, Veronica Yen, from struggling to learn to learning to struggle.
Growing up, I was one of those kids that did well in school, and I was proud of it. I sat in the front of the class, I got A's on every exam, and I was known as the smart kid. I was learning faster than all my friends, and because of this fact, I was sure I'd created a method that was the key to making learning easy and effective. Inspired by that idea, I applied and was accepted to UCLA's psychology program to uncover the answer to what makes learning easy. But once I got to grad school, I began to realize that I'd been asking the wrong question. In lab meeting after lab meeting, I listened to researchers discuss, get this, making learning more difficult. As it turns out, many of the study strategies that learners use, that I myself had been using, only made learning feel easy. But in reality, this created only an illusion of learning. You see, when learners are required to be more active, to struggle and engage more deeply with the information, they ultimately learn better. So to illustrate this point, let me share with you an experiment that came out of the lab that I'm a part of, the Bjork Human Learning and Forgetting Lab, right here at UCLA. So in this study, 2 groups of participants were told that they had to learn to recognize the painting styles of 12 different artists by studying their paintings. So the first group concentrated on one artist at a time. So for example, they would see 6 paintings by Lewis in a row, followed by 6 paintings by Slorf, and so on until they had gone through all 12 artists. So here's how this part of the experiment looked. Here's a painting by Lewis, and every 3 seconds, a new painting would appear. And by the 3rd painting or the 4th painting, I'm starting to get a feeling for what Lewis's style looks like. He's got those thick brush strokes, those vivid color choices. All right, I think I got Lewis. How about you? All right, now the second group, they studied the same paintings by the same 12 artists, but this time in a mixed up order. So here's how it felt for the second group. Here's a picture by Slorf, okay? Wexler, all right. Oh, Pisani, that looks a little different, got it. Stratulet, oh, blurry-ish, I guess. Hawkins, oh gosh, just 5 artists in, and I'm already overwhelmed. Oh wait, Slorf again, I know that name. But wait a minute, what did that first Slorf painting look like again? We then checked to see whether the learners had truly learned to recognize an artist's work. We showed them new paintings that they had never seen before by these artists and asked them which painting belonged with which artist. Now, which group do you think did better? The first one, right? I mean, just going through that demo, seeing the same artist 6 times in a row felt so much more organized, so much easier. Mixing them up just felt confusing. And in fact, this is what the experimenters who first conducted this study believed. And even the learners who went through this study said that studying artists one at a time was better for their learning. However, contrary to what I thought, to what the experimenters thought, and even to what the learners themselves thought, the second group, who studied the artists all mixed up, learned their styles a lot better. There are many other examples in psychology where people's intuitions about learning are wrong. For instance, students are often given the advice that they should pick one place to study and do all of their studying there. But research has in fact shown the opposite to be true. If learners really want to learn the information, they're much better off studying in many different places. Or another example is that students often believe that if they read a chapter over and over again, that's learning. But again, it's been found to be much more effective if they read the chapter once, close the book, and then try to recall the important concepts from memory. In other words, test themselves. The set of strategies that make learning feel less easy, but are in fact more effective because they engage the learners more deeply, are referred to as desirable difficulties. And because the majority of learning takes place outside of the classroom, back in the dorm room or in the library, learning is for the most part self-regulated. So it is important that we teach students not just what to learn, but also how to learn. But with so many believing that learning should be easy, how can we convince them of the effectiveness of desirable difficulties? So I took this painting study, and I tried to show learners that they had in fact learned better when studying the artists all mixed up by drawing their attention to the link between their test performance and their initial study method. This didn't work. People still thought that studying artists one at a time was better for their own learning. So I then tried sharing statistics, telling them, in fact, 90% of people learn better when they study the artists all mixed up, even though it feels easier to study the artists one at a time. Still didn't work. They still didn't believe me. So I went further. I even explained to them why. Because when you mix the artists up, this highlights the differences between them, which is what is really critical for this task. Guess what? They still didn't believe me. With all the scientific research, and even having gone through learning in this way for themselves, how could they not see the effectiveness of desirable difficulties? But then I thought about everything that I've learned here in grad school, and then about how I study. And then I realized, I'm not sure I believe it either. What was it that I said again at the beginning? That I was the smart kid, and that in my formative years, learning came easy to me. But now that I think about it, it's because I avoided the things that were hard. For example, regional competitions that would pit me against other smart people, if there was even a chance that I would fail in front of others, I wouldn't do it. And it's because of what I believed that struggle, or worse, failure meant. That I was stupid, that I was a fraud, only masquerading as smart. It turns out that I was suffering from what Carol Dweck, a psychologist at Stanford, refers to as a fixed mindset, a belief that intelligence is innate and cannot be changed. People with fixed mindsets cope poorly with criticism and failure because they're highly concerned with maintaining a positive self-image. They avoid challenges. Why do I need to prove that I'm smart? Or worse, what if it proves that I'm not? And as a result, they never really reach their full potential. On the other hand, people with growth mindsets who believe that intelligence can be increased with effort, they learn from criticism and embrace challenges, and ultimately achieve more because they don't shy away from struggle. Reading about the fixed mindset, I really felt like Carol Dweck was peering into my brain. When we talk about learning, there really are two very different things that we mean. As the girl sat in the front of the class getting straight A's, learning to me meant that I had to maintain that outward appearance of success, to keep getting those A's. And I did just enough so I could perform well on exams. The study methods I used were those that made me feel good and even made me look good. But I mean, I can't tell you about any of the materials that I crammed for in college. Now, real learning that lasts, on the other hand, real understanding goes deeper and requires methods that feel and are completely different from learning just for the sake of getting high marks on an exam. What I'm learning is that struggle and failure are not signs that I'm not good enough. And I'm learning that it's important to let that fear go. And I'm beginning to learn that struggle and failure are really central to the process of true learning. And that in order for me to continue to grow, I've got to place my trust in desirable difficulties.
Our next speaker is Liz Kaufman from the Department of Sociology. Life on a Tightrope, Suspending Adulthood in the Free Agent Nation.
Have you ever dreamt of being your own boss? Working from wherever you want, being able to choose the projects that you really want to work on? I definitely did. And so after college, I decided to turn down a full-time job offer and become a freelance blogger. On the one hand, I had all the perks of a freelance lifestyle. I got to travel the world, I had variety in my days, I had the autonomy to make creative decisions. I even got to wear my pajamas to work every now and then. On the other hand, I had none of the benefits of a full-time job. No health insurance, no retirement savings, no job security. After about a year of working for myself, I realized I was not going to cut it as a freelancer. I didn't have the actual skills, the business skills that you needed to grow a freelance career, and I just couldn't quite stomach all the uncertainty. So after moving in with my parents for a few months to regroup, I decided to move to New York to look for a stable job. Except by this point, the economy had taken a turn for the worse, and all those jobs that were so plentiful when I graduated had all but disappeared. So as a last resort, I signed up with a temp agency. And this is where I learned that flexibility in a free agent nation goes both ways. So this time, it was the companies that contracted my services who were the free and the flexible ones. Instead of hiring a permanent employee, they could hire me for as long or as short as they needed. Around this time, I started noticing news stories about other people who were doing contract work and were insecure like I was. So computer programmers hired by tech giants like Microsoft. They were hired to do work of permanent employees, but they weren't entitled to many of the benefits or labor law protections. Adjuncts, who do the bulk of teaching on many college campuses, but have to cobble together short-term contracts to make ends meet. Amazon warehouse workers hired through temp agencies. I learned that they weren't entitled to unemployment insurance if they lost their job because they were sick and they missed a day of work. Started wondering, why are these jobs spreading? And what is it going to mean for individuals and society if getting a long-term contract with a stable employer is no longer a given? I decided to go back to graduate school in sociology to learn more. I wanted to develop what sociologist C. Wright Mills calls the sociological imagination, the ability to connect personal troubles with broader public issues. For my PhD research, I decided to study free agents. Independent contractors, freelancers, temps, day laborers, what researchers call non-standard or precarious workers. I learned that non-standard workers are becoming more common in the United States, about 16 million workers today. I also learned that while the media has portrayed a largely positive picture of a happy, liberated, free agent nation, economists have actually found that having a non-standard job can lead to negative impacts on future job prospects and on long-term earnings potential. But I felt like this was just half the picture. I felt like economists were so focused on our workplace lives, they weren't talking about or exploring all the other parts of our lives that are important to us, like our family lives and our community lives. For me, as a temp and a freelancer, the hardest part wasn't necessarily the paycheck, it was feeling like I wasn't an adult. I wasn't part of normal adult society. Consider that in the 1960s, by around age 25, most men and women had graduated from school, got a full-time job, left their parents' house, married, and started families of their own, by around 25. Today, 42% of young people in their 20s live at home with their parents, up more than 50% since the 1970s. The media has a term for this. They call us the boomerang generation. And in my dissertation, I argue that the rise in precarious employment has something to do with us boomeranging back home. I've found that 20-somethings with non-standard jobs have about 40% higher odds of living at home with their parents than 20-somethings with standard employment. And this is even comparing individuals who are otherwise similar in terms of social background, education, and even income. I've also found that 20-somethings with precarious work are about 30% less likely to get married by age 32, again, comparing otherwise similar 20-somethings with standard employment. So overall, I found that my initial enthusiasm about being a free agent was a little bit naive. And I'm not saying that we should all go out and get a 9-to-5. Many of us don't want that kind of job. And many of us who do want that kind of job can't find one. Even knowing what I know now, I'm still excited by the idea of being a freelancer and the flexibility that that entails. But today, being a non-standard worker requires a lot of risk. Some of us are very fortunate to have our families who can be our safety nets, but other people are not so fortunate. And by providing their young adult children with a safety net, like living at home or giving money, parents may be risking their own retirement security. So with employers less likely to provide benefits, families and individuals are having to shoulder more of the burden. But what if there was a way for all workers to have access to a safety net as they strive toward independence? Some other countries provide some great examples. So in France, freelancers are able to contribute to an unemployment insurance scheme where if their work starts to run low, they can draw on that to make ends meet. Denmark has a flexicurity employment model that promises flexibility for employers to hire and fire workers, but guarantees workers the security that they need through very generous unemployment benefits and through lifelong retraining opportunities. In the US, we still haven't thought actively enough about what we can do to also best adapt to changes in the economy. Right now, it seems like we have two choices. Get a 9-to-5 if you can, or live a life that's full of uncertainty. And I'm proposing that we begin to develop a third option, where we accept that flexible short-term jobs are the future for many of us. And that's why we have to include everyone into a better safety net. And such a safety net is not going to build itself. It's going to require some bold new public policies and laws. Unfortunately, in my research, I've found that non-standard workers are less likely to vote than those with traditional employment. And that's a problem because if you're not voting, elected representatives have little incentive to represent your interests. So it's critical that non-standard workers vote and are brought into the political process. You may not be a free agent today, but the odds are that you will be at some point in your life, or that your kids, or maybe grandkids, will be. My wish is that we begin to band together and think of creative ways to expand and improve the safety net for all of us. I believe that is going to be the key to having a thriving society in the new economy, where individuals and employers can take risks, but families have the stability to grow and be nurtured.
Childhood stress. Does your body remember? Alexandra Crosswell from the Department of Psychology.
Have you ever thought that the stress you're experiencing today might seriously impact your health tomorrow? The reason I ask this question is based on a day I'll never forget. During a difficult year in high school, we heard the tragic news that my sister's best friend had died in a car accident. My mom, heartbroken, said to me, "This isn't good for me. I can feel it in my body." 2 years later, she was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors found the disease everywhere, in her hip bone, her lymph nodes, her lungs. And what she said to me about feeling the emotional pain really stuck with me. And I wondered, could she really feel the stress affecting her body? Could stress be the culprit that caused my beautiful 50-year-old mother, who had never smoked a cigarette in her life, to be diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer? From the pain of losing her grew an intense intellectual curiosity. I wanted to know, how were the mind and body connected? Deep within me, I knew that they had to be. And I wanted to be the one conducting the research, showing the scientific and medical communities this fundamental truth. So with this question, I began a PhD program in health psychology, where we study the mind-body connection. As I began my work, I first started studying women who had been diagnosed with cancer and how stress affected their health. As I worked my way from study to study, I found that stress mattered, but not as much as I thought. Women who were under a great deal of stress at the time of their diagnosis had slightly worse health overall, but it didn't seem to make that big of a difference in how their cancer grew. In one of my classes, we started reading about early life stress. Stress during childhood, like witnessing violence or being physically or emotionally abused or neglected, has a clear and strong association with worse mental and physical health in adulthood. So I wondered, could I have been studying the wrong kind of stress? Maybe instead of studying the stress that the women were undergoing as adults, it was more important to understand their childhood experiences. One type of stress can be caused from the family environment you grow up in. Researchers at UCLA have identified a cluster of family characteristics that put children at risk for worse health down the road. These include a lot of fighting and conflict in the home, parents that are emotionally unengaged, and a chaotic daily life. When I first started reading about what is termed now risky families, I thought of a little girl that I've mentored for the past 4 years, Kimberly. I met Kimberly when she was 10 years old. She lives in a home I would classify in this risky category, in a crime-ridden neighborhood in Los Angeles. She has no set bedtime. She's often up until 4 a.m. She doesn't get help with reading or homework, and she's been held back twice already in elementary school. One reason researchers think that growing up in this risky family environment is bad for your health is because you learn to interact in social situations in specific ways. If you witness a lot of fighting and arguing and not a lot of demonstrations of love and support, the reasoning goes, then you'll only learn how to respond to social situations with aggression and conflict. So then the rest of your life, whenever you're faced with a social interaction that might be conflictual, you're going to respond more aggressively. To test this theory, I brought 95 UCLA students, one at a time, into my research lab. Half of the students had grown up in risky families, and the other half in warm and loving homes. In this experiment, 2 students participate in a role-playing scenario. Unbeknownst to the study volunteer, the other participant is actually a hired actor, posing as a volunteer. The study volunteer is asked to convince the actor to turn down his music because it's so loud she's unable to study for her final exam that was scheduled for the next morning. Annoyingly, the actor refuses to comply and starts insulting the volunteer with things like, "Stop nagging me, you sound like my mother." So frustrated, the volunteer turns to me, the researcher, and says, "What do I do? He's not going to compromise." And I look at her straight in the eye and say, "Every other participant has been able to reach a compromise. You must not have a compelling enough argument. Please continue." So here you are, stuck in this small room with this aggressive stranger and a researcher who's implying you're incompetent. Oh, and did I mention you're being videotaped? As you can imagine, this is stressful. The volunteers' blood pressure and heart rate go up, and their bodies start producing the stress hormone cortisol, which we measure in their saliva. What I thought the results would show is that students in the risky family group would be more aggressive to the actor, and that their bodies would respond more aggressively too, with a greater increase in blood pressure, heart rate, and cortisol. But that's not what I found. The 2 groups did not differ in their response on any of the variables I measured. But how could that be? How could witnessing more conflict and receiving less nurturing from your parents not influence the way that you responded to conflict in adulthood? What was I missing? Soon after the experiment was over, I started writing up the results. And as I did, a surprisingly different truth began to emerge. Perhaps this wasn't a story about stress, but a story about resilience. As I looked closer at who the participants in my study actually were, at what made the risky family group different from the warm and loving group, I saw something I didn't expect. I expected the students in the risky family group to be really struggling to make friends, to feel connected, and in general, having a tougher time managing college life. But contrary to these preconceived notions, the students in the risky family group actually showed the same level of happiness and the same level of self-esteem as those in the warm and loving group. And even more interestingly, the risky family group had higher levels of optimism and higher levels of empathy. In other words, experiencing more stress in childhood was associated with a more positive outlook on the future and greater empathy towards others. These students were resilient. They had overcome difficult childhood experiences, gotten into UCLA, and were thriving. In an effort to recruit students into my study who had experienced stress in childhood, I had inadvertently recruited a group of really resilient young adults. But not everyone who goes through difficult circumstances, either in childhood or adulthood, is able to overcome them. How did these students do it? What strategies did they use to build and maintain resilience over the years? These are the questions I hope to answer next. As I think about the role of resilience in my own life, I think about my family. We had a really tough time after we lost my mom. But we stumbled along and eventually became strong and resilient, handling each new challenge with a little bit more grace every time. As my husband and I get ready to welcome our first child into the world, I wonder, how can we help him build the resilience he needs to thrive? What does it take to teach someone to overcome difficulties and grow from them? Because what I've learned is that what defines us most is how we handle the everyday challenges life inevitably brings.
And now we move back to the Department of Anthropology. Lisa Nuwan will talk about gaming and the construction of global communities.
In the field of linguistic anthropology, people traditionally think about communities as being tied to the languages you speak, the regions you're from, and the people you know and talk to face every day. But as digital media and technology are increasingly becoming a greater part of our everyday lives, this model for understanding community needs to be expanded, reimagined, to account for expansive networks of people all around the world. Connected through digital media, these people share not only languages, common references, and the occasional cat meme, but they also share a deeper understanding of identity and belonging. And so I ask, is digital media and technology influencing the ways in which we form communities and organize our everyday social worlds in the digital age? For my dissertation, I sought to answer this question by studying how global communities are constructed, specifically through the lens of a video game startup company called Riot Games in the Los Angeles area. Through my fieldwork, I wanted to understand how developers and players together co-construct a sense of belonging and community across the miles through their social networks, and in particular, how this connection is built and rebuilt every single day through language and communication. And so in order to better understand this idea of community, I became an intern at Riot Games. They created and are now pretty famous for the game known as League of Legends. In the summer of 2009, I worked in the community department, and it was here that I really got to witness how the community was built from the ground up. Back then, the community department consisted of 4 guys and me sitting in a small room with rows of desks filled to capacity with computer monitors, action figures, and other video games. Our job was a combination of beta testing the game and researching ways to build community, which involved getting people together in conversation around ideas and products through social media and events. It's been nearly 4.5 years since Riot Games released League of Legends, and in that time, they have become the most popular online game in the world today, with over 67 million monthly players, which, to put in perspective, is slightly larger than the entire population of France. And in those 4.5 years, the early community that I helped play a very small role in developing has grown in tremendous ways. For example, the game and other media is now translated into 20 different languages. And while translating the game into other languages is a huge effort, that's not the only big challenge. So is culture. And cultural nuances can be so subtle. For instance, in China, government policy forbids any undead or ghosts to be seen while playing the game. And in Germany, it's blood. And while these localized communities may have their own specific guidelines as to what constitutes appropriateness in the community, they're all still part of the global League of Legends community. Another layer that adds to the complexity of community is the growing popularity of esports, which is where teams from around the world come together to compete in the sport of professional gaming. For example, this past October, the League of Legends Season 3 World Finals took place at the Staples Center here in Los Angeles. Over 13,000 people from around the world came together to watch the best international teams compete. And those who couldn't attend, all 32 million of them, watched online, all the while using social media in conversation around their favorite players, shared memories, and shared experiences. And as popularity continues to rise, so do the financial opportunities for these top teams. For example, on a regional and international level, there are titles, trophies, and at the very peak of competition, millions of dollars to be won. But these events are complex, not because of their sheer enormity or because of what's at stake. They're complex because of the very different ways people participate and experience these events, both online, through streamed media and live, and through different languages, regions, and cultural contexts. As a digital ethnographer, my job is to hang out and observe, both online and offline, how players and developers construct a sense of belonging, identity, and through their identity, in spite of linguistic barriers, cultural differences, and geographic distances. Looking mostly at English-speaking players, I found that players and developers construct this sense of belonging using a wide array of different strategies. For example, I found that linguistic style plays a huge role in community development. Feelings of belonging are constructed through the minute everyday conversations that players have with each other, conversations that are often taken for granted. Players use terms that the community understands in order to mark their membership. terms such as carrying, or where you play so well that you actually carry your team to victory, or words such as feeding, which is the opposite of carrying, where you die so much in the game that you're actually feeding the team, the opposite team, an advantage. I found that a sense of belonging was constructed not only through the choice of words that people were saying, but the ways in which these words were being said. I also found that players and developers were co-constructing communities through formulating social norms or by negotiating a moral framework. They talked about who they are and who they are not. They evaluate and determine what constitutes appropriate community behavior and what doesn't through conversations on social media, events, and other arenas. These two strategies of style and using language to negotiate social norms are strategies that people in face-to-face communities often use. But what I found to be really different about the ways in which players and developers were building these global communities is their heavy reliance on cultural and linguistic intermediaries, or in other words, working with translators. For instance, at a gaming conference in Cologne, Germany, a French crocodile really brought this point to light. Standing on a stage in front of a massive crowd of League of Legends fans, a teenage boy in a papier-mâché Renekton costume, which is a ferocious crocodile from the game, stood on stage looking somewhat bewildered. He had just won a costume contest and was being interviewed by an English-speaking broadcaster. Holding the microphone up to his long snout, she said, "Renekton, you are the winner. What went into building this costume? How long did it take?" He paused for a moment, and then he blurted out, "I'm French." Still holding the microphone next to his nose in anticipation of an answer, he nervously repeated, "French, I'm French, I'm French, I'm French." Within moments, videos and remixed videos of this interaction had gone viral, poking fun of the absence of a much-needed translator and the communicative breakdown that had occurred. This interaction with the crocodile was really important to me because it made me realize just how central language is in building communities. And while translators are in no way new, the sheer scale and delicate nuances pose a really heavy challenge in the construction of communities in a multilingual, multicultural, and digitally connected world. As digital technology continues to become an increasingly important part of our everyday worlds, popular media and ideology continue to oversimplify online and offline communication. Face-to-face communication is often seen as real, meaningful, whereas face-to-screen communication is often seen as more trivial or less meaningful. But to me, these social worlds are so complex and multi-layered than the way they're portrayed. In reality, I see games like League of Legends and other social media as portals that bring people together to form these communities through common interests and common ways of being. Whether that be bringing people together to watch an international championship in a stadium or in a PC cafe or at a LAN party or online, these people are actively engaging in ways that build communities. And what I'm striving towards in this research is to really understand how people create a sense of belonging online, tangibly, by looking very closely at language and how people communicate with each other. Because belonging is so important to how we understand ourselves and each other, it is critical that we come to understand how this basic human need, this type of connection, is built and rebuilt every single day through language and interaction, both online and offline. And in doing this research It is my dream that people come together and realize, whatever the modality, language brings us together, making it possible for us to form connections, build communities, belong, and to ultimately be a part of something bigger.
Our next speaker from the Department of Psychology, Tristan Inagaki. Love notes and hand warmers. Does your brain know the difference?
Have you ever wondered why you bond with another person? What makes you feel so close to your mom, your dad? Siblings or best friend? And why do some couples stay married, happily married, for 50 years or more? In social neuroscience, we look to the brain to understand how we take in and process something psychological, like bonding. We social neuroscientists are a lot like psychologists. We both study thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But what sets us apart is that we also monitor the reaction of the brain. Now, before I began this PhD journey, I was a ballerina, and my world revolved around expressing emotions through movement. And a knee injury late in my junior year of college made me really rethink my future. And one day, while sitting in a social psychology class, I came to the realization that this discipline really complemented the way I saw the world. And so that week, I marched out, careful of my knee, and changed my major from dance to psychology. It was here in this very class that I first learned about and fell in love with the field of social neuroscience. Now, when it comes to bonding, I've learned that one of the reasons it feels so great is that it shares some of the same pathways in the brain as those that control our relatively warm internal body temperature. So in other words, social warmth, or feeling deeply connected to those we love, and our physical warmth often overlap and use some of the same biological hardware. To learn this, we first recruited 20 volunteers from the UCLA community to participate in a brain imaging experiment. We wanted to know how warmth might contribute to feeling bonded. So for instance, when you're first born and you feel the warmth of your mother's body, and this feeling gets intermixed with those of emotional love. So to test this theory, we needed to create social connection and social warmth, physical warmth, all within the same experiment. And so, with our participants' permission, we contacted their spouses, parents, best friends, and siblings via email. For each volunteer, we contacted 6 separate loved ones, and we asked these friends and family to write 6 brief, loving sentences. And the reason they had to be brief was that they had to fit onto the lenses of the goggles that they would be wearing as we monitored their brain activity in the scanner. Now, we didn't really have a clue as to how these messages or sentences would turn out. We hoped they would be really good, but it was really anyone's guess. And it wasn't until the responses finally started coming in that I knew this was going to be a really exciting experiment. So one volunteer's grandmother completely failed to follow directions and sent me a dissertation-length letter all about how wonderful and special her granddaughter is. Another volunteer's father basically sent me 20 different sentences, 20 different ways, but all basically saying the same thing: how proud he was of his daughter and how much he loved her. Overall, we were surprised by this outpouring of love and how people could share such beautiful thoughts and feelings in just 6 short sentences. Here are a few examples of the messages that we received and that our participants read while they were lying in the MRI. Thank you for loving me at my worst. You're my number one. Thank you for helping me be the best I can be. I'm so grateful to have you in my life, and I completely don't deserve you. You're a gift. You are the bacon bits in our salad bowl of life. When they were done reading these sentences, they remained in the scanner so that we could then move on to complete the second half of the experiment. We had our volunteers hold one of those single-use hand warmer packs, the kind you use at frigid football games and while you're out skiing. And this hand warmer was how we increased the physical warmth in our participants. So what did we discover from this study? Well, after holding this hand warmer, our volunteers said that they felt more connected to their loved ones. Just this simple act of holding a warm, squishy bag, and we saw increases in feelings of social connectedness. The volunteers also said that they felt physically warmer after reading the sentences. So physical warmth was leading to more social warmth, and social warmth was leading to more physical warmth. Our scans also revealed that some of the same regions in the brain used to process physical warmth are also those that process social warmth. So we showed for the first time that those warm feelings that come from being connected to someone you love may actually feel physically warm, and that this is likely because the same brain regions are used to process both sensations. So we learned that bonding feels pleasantly warm, but we wanted to dig deeper. So we recruited another set of 30 participants to complete the same two-part experiment with just slightly different parameters. First, instead of having them lie in a scanner, we had them sit in front of a computer in a lab. And second, before they read their loving messages, we had them take a pill that blocks the natural opioid receptors in the brain. So when we blocked our volunteers' opioids, essentially blocking this pleasure center in the brain, our volunteers said that they felt significantly less connected and less warm after reading the loving sentences, and less connected after holding the hand warmer. But what we didn't anticipate was that our volunteers still said that it was really pleasurable to read the loving messages, even after their opioids were blocked. The primary difference was that after taking this pill, they felt less connected to the friends and family who wrote them the messages. Or in other words, we found that opioids were important for feeling bonded and close to those you love, but not necessarily to how pleasurable it is to hear that you're loved. Together, the results about physical warmth, as well as the results about opioids, both really excited and surprised us. They told us why bonding feels so great at this neurochemical level, but also at a psychological level, about why we feel so close to others. They also help us better understand a common experience that we all share. So why do we bond with others? Because for the same reasons that we need food and water, we need to bond with others. It's part of our survival. In fact, social connection is so much of a basic need that it's weaved into our neurochemistry and into our brains. It's weaved into the very fabric that makes us, us. But what do these results mean beyond this dissertation? For me, it's about getting back to those micro-social connection moments, those cherished moments that our busy lives so often cover up. And the only way to really do this is to take the time and stop and share your gratitude. It's not only incredibly valuable for the other person, it's also vitally important for your well-being too. And so the next time you want to let someone know how much you love them, just remember it doesn't take that long. All it takes is a pen, some paper, and just a few simple, heartfelt words.
Our next speaker is from the Department of Political Science, Amanda Rizkawa Chown. Coffins, Castles, and the Aftermath of Civil War in Lebanon.
In the summer of 2009, while I was in Lebanon studying at the American University of Beirut, my friends and I decided to escape from the city to the beautiful mountains of the north for the weekend. The taxi cab pulled up and we piled in. I chose the front seat, which gave me an opportunity to chat with the driver about the weather, family, the tourist season. About a half an hour into our drive, we came upon a tunnel along the highway. I noticed the driver's grip tighten around the steering wheel, and I could feel his apprehension. I asked, "Is everything okay?" He said, "Tunnels conjure up really difficult memories for me. During the war, taking this very drive into that Christian area would have meant certain death for a Muslim like me. I've only done it a couple of times since the end of the events." That's the way the Lebanese refer to their 15-year-long civil war. His story confused me. At the time, it had been 20 years since the end of the conflict, and we were on a major highway. In the last 10 years, Beirut had become the summer playground of the Middle East's rich and famous. To me, it appeared safe. What was there to be afraid of? But the driver's story stuck with me. How was it that his account of Beirut clashed so sharply with its current playground image? Between my parents' own personal struggles during Lebanon's civil war and the driver's, I was left with a burning question. How is it that post-war reconciliation and peace building is achieved after such a violent conflict, especially when so many people remember the trauma? So, in 2011, I returned to Lebanon as a political science graduate student and began talking to anyone and everyone that was willing to share their story. I speak Arabic, so I was able to ask more subtle questions, but no matter how I asked, the responses came back the same. The end of the war hasn't really changed anything. It's still the same old game. Things will always be like that here. This religious group against that one. Salam, ayya salam. Peace? What peace? You talk as if the war is over. These responses were not what I was expecting. I thought at least someone would acknowledge all the positive changes. It was depressing. See, I was so sure that I knew about Lebanon because of my family. But what I didn't understand at the time was that my privileged upbringing had led me to begin my research under the very naive assumption that everyone benefited from peace. These interviews also poked a fatal hole in my grand plans for studying reconciliation because, as it seemed, there was none. A few days later, my cousin and I were walking down the busy streets of Hamra, a famously cosmopolitan district of Beirut. Here, the war seemed far away. But as we turned the next corner, graffiti on the wall caught my attention. It was the castle from the Disney logo, but right underneath were the words, "War makes coffins and castles." The coffins part seemed tragically self-explanatory. But what about the castles? See, although the Lebanese civil war left the majority of the population reeling from human and financial loss, a few people had benefited wildly from the conflict. They reaped enormous profits from the weapons and drug trades and from payments made by foreign powers trying to influence the outcome. Some of these figures were warlords that used their resources to simultaneously build militias and popular bases of support. They offered protection and some basic services in exchange for people's loyalty. Kind of like the mob, but on a much larger scale and packaged in a shell of political ideology and/or religious solidarity. In negotiations to end the war, these warlords had to be guaranteed a piece of the government pie in order for them to give up their weapons. So once an agreement was reached, they turned in their Kalashnikovs for suits and ties and became parliament members and ministers. The people that did the sectarian cleansing were the ones now redistributing reparations to those displaced by the war. They decided how to rebuild the country's infrastructure and which businesses would get the contracts. They ended up using the resources of the state to empower themselves by reinforcing wartime divisions. And not surprisingly, efforts at truth and reconciliation were dead in the water. Politicians refused to deal with the past, mostly because they themselves were responsible for most war crimes. To understand how these leaders were able to hold on to power for so long, I decided to visit two adjacent sectarian enclaves of the city of Tripoli, one Alawite Muslim and the other Sunni. Before the war, these were one neighborhood. And although in 2011 they were considered the most dangerous places in Lebanon, I felt that in order to truly grasp how the system worked, I had to visit. Through a string of connections, I secured safe passage into one of the neighborhoods and a meeting with a local leader. The only person I told I was going was my cousin, and he insisted on accompanying me. When we arrived at the man's corner store, he immediately escorted us to the back of the shop, into a small, dimly lit room. He asked us to have a seat as he locked the door. As soon as I sat down, a lump formed in my throat, and I had a flash of realization that this visit might not have been the best idea. Then he sat down, poured us a coffee, and said, "Now we can talk." During our 3-hour visit, he explained how local strongmen rule the territory. Many of the poorer inhabitants could not go to school, get a job, or even an apartment without approval. Even worse, there was a segment of young men that were deliberately kept unemployed, so that when it came time to be a paid participant in the unrest, they were available and more than willing to fight because they were in desperate need of money. This ability to create conflict at a moment's notice served the agendas of the outside powers funding the local elites. Today, 3 years after my first visit, these neighborhoods are the scene of open war. They were the first places into which the Syrian conflict spilled over. So, what is the solution for these recurring conflicts? Honestly, the journey has left me with more questions than answers. But I am using my research to illuminate the inherent dilemma found in all power-sharing agreements. Because they have the power to use their militias to spoil peace processes, these warlords must be included in any settlement. However, their inclusion can create real barriers for democratic competition, fair compensation for the displaced, and truth for people whose family members disappeared during the war. Since the end of the Cold War, negotiated settlements have gone up from 10% to 40% of war endings. This is the most likely way that many ongoing conflicts, including the one in Syria, are going to be ended. Learning from the Lebanese experience is crucial if true reconciliation and peace is our hope for war-torn countries. Policy circles currently define peace as the end or interruption of violence. I want more. I want a higher standard. My hope is that we would redefine what we mean by the word peace, that it would be a richer term, one that encapsulates truth, forgiveness, reconciliation, and genuine healing. I dream of a day when I can go to Lebanon and have a conversation with a stranger without knowing that the first question they will ask me will be a thinly veiled attempt to find out what sect I belong to. I dream of a day when they'll just see me, a fellow human being, and a fellow Lebanese.
We have two more speakers. Our next speaker is Pamela Prickett from the Department of Sociology, Seeking Salam in South Central.
Thank you. How does religion help people survive? 6 years ago, I set out to revisit this age-old question. I wanted to know how religion matters in the everyday lives of people struggling with poverty and what they do to help each other. I'm not religious, but I've always been fascinated by how people feel inspired and also divided by religious identity. I chose to study Islam, and I believed that I could and should maintain some objective distance as an outsider. So I located a mosque in South Central, a predominantly African-American mosque, and I was given permission from staff to observe. Some of my professors suggested that I might not be the most obvious candidate to conduct fieldwork in an African-American mosque, but I was too stubborn to hear otherwise. So I went to the mosque, and in those early days, I found some really outgoing members to talk to. They seemed really ready to tell me what they believe it means to be Muslim. For example, they were quick to point out that female members dressed modestly, but in ways that balanced being Muslim with being American. And they were proud to teach me that the first Muslims in the US were black. Approximately 15% of African slaves came from Muslim countries and were forced to convert to Christianity. Many of the members I talked to saw Islam as a return to their rightful religion. But when these friendly faces at the mosque weren't around to offer advice, I really struggled to know the rules of interaction. So I had this experience where I was trying to interview a young woman in her 20s when her fiancé came up, grabbed her arm, and pulled her away from me. Then, shortly after that, I was having what I perceived as a perfectly normal conversation with a staff member when, at the end, he kind of awkwardly leaned into the lapel of my jacket and said, "Of course you're welcome here, as long as you don't bring any terrorists." I just kind of stood there, "Oh, okay, you're making a joke, like I'm wearing a wire." Right. There were a lot of stories going around at the time about different local law enforcement agencies trying to send people into Muslim communities to get information. I didn't think anyone would seriously think that I was an undercover agent. But then I began to notice that he wasn't the only one who suggested maybe I was not who I said I was. And even one of the friendly faces I met told me I asked too many questions. So I decided then that I would stop trying to be a neutral observer and I would become an active participant. And probably for the first time in my life, a quiet, active participant. I started going to religious classes and worship services. I volunteered at community events. That first Ramadan, I attended 30 out of 31 community dinners. It was during these dinners that I really began to see how much the community struggled to balance its religious ideals with the everyday realities of life around them. So during Ramadan, believers fast from the first light of sun until sunset, sometimes going 15 or 16 hours without any food or drink. At night, they like to gather at the masjid, their term for mosque, to share a simple homemade meal, usually some chicken and rice, fish, maybe some collard greens. They also see it as their religious duty to feed the less fortunate during this time. So they invited non-Muslims from the neighborhood to come in and get a plate. But sometimes the food started to run out before all the members had been served. Some got frustrated that people from the street ate before those who were fasting. Others argued that people from the street shouldn't be allowed to eat with the believers, since a lot of times the guests were battling drug and alcohol problems and might have been dressed in ways that members didn't think appropriate. Still, even with all of these tensions, Ramadan became my favorite time of year to do field work. I loved seeing members bond over fasting and getting the food made. It was, as one member told me, poor helping the poor. Members see Islam as a way of life that demands faith and action. They believe strongly that against all the struggles around them, all the struggles they face, they can pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and get ahead. And I think we all want to believe this, really, that if somebody just works hard enough, he or she can overcome any hardship. Religious leaders, known as imams, wove this bootstrapping ideology into their teachings. They encouraged members to work hard and not give up. A lot of members thought that the mosque should be a place of spiritual and material support to aid them in these struggles. For some, this meant turning to the mosque when they had nowhere else to go to eat or sleep. For others, it meant trying to start their own businesses with the help of their Muslim brothers and sisters, turning the mosque into a marketplace to sell goods and services. And everyone at the masjid relied on the help of wealthier Muslim communities for donations, like here, when they got toys from another mosque to give away to kids in their community. Unfortunately, remember, I'm a sociologist, so there's going to be an unfortunately. Unfortunately, all this hard work only gets members so far. The community is strained by too few resources to spread around. While they want to help each other, I've come to see that they're also in competition. Within minutes of taking this photograph, all the toys had been given away. And there's a tremendous amount of tension from internal systems of inequality. Those who don't have money look at those who do with suspicion. I felt this tension better after I moved to be closer to the masjid. Like members from the neighborhood, I began to see the religious leaders who commuted there in a different, more critical light. I understood why some members mistrusted leaders who drove fancy cars and were vague about how much money the mosque was bringing in. But I kind of also understood the leaders had to be vague to prevent too many demands on the mosque or themselves at any given time. By this point, I was a few years into the project, and I was spending a lot of my nights and weekends at the mosque. And I loved it. In fact, I loved my fieldwork so much that some of the members mistook my passion for the research as proof I was finding Islam. But after 5 years, it became painfully apparent to members that I didn't intend to take my shahada, the term for declaring an Islamic faith. Some of the members started shutting me out. I didn't get invited to the women's annual tea party that I'd helped organize the year before. I didn't get calls about some of the members who'd passed and had upcoming funerals. And those rumors that I might be FBI, they began to resurface. At first, I was hurt. I thought, God, after all these years, they still don't trust me? But then, and for this I'm really grateful, it reminded me. I set out to study a religious community for a faith I don't believe in. I got so wrapped up in their daily struggles and those of the neighborhood, I sort of forgot that I first went in to study their lives as Muslims. So after all that time, there I was, back on the outside looking in. Understandably, members don't want to be watched by outsiders as they struggle. And that makes my job difficult. I respect that members want to be left alone, but at the same time feel that their stories need to be told. I firmly believe that their collective struggles reveal something fundamental about US society. That as much as we want to believe we can climb the social ladder with earnest effort alone, as individuals and small communities, we're really limited in what we can do, given our social positions. Now, I've come to embrace that I'm different from the men and women I studied, for what it helps me do as a sociologist. I hope by explaining their lives to a world outside, I can inspire greater understanding. I'm not Muslim. I'm not African American. I didn't grow up in South Central. But I can still relate to their struggles to strive against the odds. We all can. We may know that we're not always going to overcome our hardships, but we still try. As members would say, we need faith and action.
We're down to our very last speaker, and there's food in the lobby as a reward.
Don't rush me.
Daniela Perry from the Department of History. 75 years of research, 75 years of confusion. Why do we still debate about media violence?
Home stretch. Okay. Have you read comic books? Watched violent movies? Or perhaps played first-person shooter video games? Well, according to a small group of media violence researchers, those of us who grew up with these activities are today more likely to behave aggressively and act violently. Of course, not all psychologists believe this. Some of them feel that the concern over media violence is way overblown. And according to millions of gamers, video game violence in no way, shape, or form causes anyone to be violent in the real world. So who's right? The concern over media violence has a long history. And as a historian of science, I study media violence investigations over the 20th century and media panics and how research is used in public policy hearings on media regulation. To research this history, I read a lot of old newspapers, magazines, read a lot of transcripts of federal hearings, and look for conversations about comic books, television, and video games. But importantly, I read the scientific literature and track how it changes over time. I've been doing this research for a few years, but in December of 2012, I felt a sense of urgency and obligation when the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting claimed the lives of 20 children. You see, after the shooting, a lot of politicians blamed video games and wanted them banned. Some psychologists agreed, but others felt that this was political deception. They wanted politicians to speak about mental health and gun control. And after some years of doing my research, I was also confused. Why do politicians think that video games are more harmful than real access to real guns? Of course, blaming entertainment is nothing new. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the arguments against movies, television, comic books, they've been the same, that the violence in the stories would teach children how to behave violently in real life. But if you look at the statistics, it tells a different story. As video game sales have gone up over the last 20 years, violent crime in the US has actually gone way down. So I thought there must be some compelling evidence if media violence researchers warn us year after year that video games are bad? What I found in the history of the research is kind of surprising. It started in the 1920s, but the most famous experiment occurred in 1961 when Albert Bandura and his colleagues at Stanford devised an experiment in which children watched a video of an adult punching and kicking an inflatable doll. The children were then placed in another room with toys, and if they were found to be punching and kicking this inflatable doll, then they were determined to be aggressive, and that television had taught them to be this way. In another experiment in 1963 by Leonard Berkowitz, college students were made to feel angry by being told that they weren't smart. They then watched a clip of the film The Champion, just the clip of Kirk Douglas boxing, and then they answered a survey. If they answered the survey in an aggressive manner, for example, if they said the survey administrator was unlikable, they were determined to be aggressive and that the film clip influenced their behavior. I point out these studies because the 1960s set the standard for experimental protocols for the next several decades. In other words, experimental techniques in media violence research haven't changed in over 50 years. Video game research, or violent video game research today, is essentially the same. College students, usually for extra credit, play a video game for just a few minutes and then are given a task to perform or answer a survey. If they perform the task in an aggressive manner or they answer the survey in an aggressive manner, they're determined to be aggressive and that the video game they just played for a few minutes influenced their behavior. Of course, some studies do consider physiological effects like heart rate and blood pressure. But whether the participant plays a violent video game or a driving game, the results are always the same. In fact, in a 2011 Supreme Court case on violent video games, the most vocal critic of violent video games, Craig Anderson, conceded that playing video games is no different than watching Saturday morning cartoons. Another clinical psychologist who also studies media violence said that recently accused this small group of media violence researchers, I don't want to piss off all the psychologists in the room, but just this small group of media violence researchers is damaging scientific ethic in their discipline. I asked him recently what the difference was between playing video games and other traditional forms of play. And he said that so far, not a single study can differentiate between playing a video game and other interactive forms of play, such as playing with toy guns. So if violent video games do have a negative impact on our behavior, we need better research methodologies. And we need better understanding of what would make a person walk into a school and shoot children. The history of the research shows that these experimental technologies lead us to a dead end, and that perhaps there are other areas that we need to pay attention to solve violence in society. For example, this LA Times article reads, "A gunman entered into a building with a high-powered rifle and began shooting." Sound familiar? Perhaps you thought of Adam Lanza or James Holmes. Maybe you thought of the Virginia Tech shooter. The media tells us that violent video games tell these young men to shoot people. But that article wasn't about any of these men. It was about a New York shooting in 2009 when a naturalized American citizen walked into an immigration center and shot 13 people. Video games were not implicated in this shooting. Or how about just a few weeks ago when a woman walked into a town hall meeting in Northern California and shot 4 people? Again, video games were not implicated in this shooting. Mass homicides are nothing new. In 1927, a school administrator killed 43 people, including 38 students, when he set off bombs around town. In 1949, a World War II veteran walked down his neighborhood street and shot 13 people, including 3 children, in just 12 minutes. And in 1966, a former Marine shot 16 people from a clock tower at UT Austin. Are we ready to blame entertainment for all of these incidents? From juvenile delinquency in the 1950s, riots in the 1960s and 70s, and mass shooting today, federal policy has always been to hold hearings on media violence effects. In 1972, the Surgeon General concluded that television violence may affect children, some of the time, under some conditions. The same is said today about video games. But which children? When? And under which conditions? No media violence effects researcher has been able to answer these questions. So if after 75 years we still don't have compelling evidence that media violence causes real-world violence, something has to change. In my work, I show that media violence researchers today used old experimental protocols that have been criticized for decades. I want the media violence researchers today to answer those questions of which child and when, under which condition. I want them to answer this question so that politicians can move on, so that the public debate can move on. I want them to answer those questions because I want the politicians to focus on other areas that have real impact on society, such as mental health and gun control.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for staying and for coming and for being such a great audience. And I have three things to say. The first thing is that you have your ballot, and very kindly, the people from the graduate division at UCLA will be counting the ballots so that Jim and I can't do any fixing or anything. So on the way out, our staff will tell you where to put them. So the first thing. The second thing I want to do is to say that we do have beverages and food outside, and I would invite you to stay for some time and to mingle among yourselves and also with our speakers. And I want to invite all our speakers, all right, great graduate students, brave graduate students, come over. And then Barbara Giordano, our coach, and Jim Stigler. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.